It is so good to be back with you. We have been off for probably the last 3 or 4 weeks due to travel and sickness. The in-person meetings are all coming back. The travel schedule this fall is crazy. Most recently I was in Ann Arbor at the Weil Institutes. I got a picture here. This is great. This is my debut as an auctioneer. No, I don't think that's actually what I was doing. I was invited to speak at the Weil Institute's Traumatic Brain Injury Summit. They have partnered with the Massey Family Foundation that is funding a lot of traumatic brain injury research. And it's so good to see people back in person. We got university systems, vendors, government funders, all put together by the folks at the Weil Institute. So that was really cool. I saw something else really cool. We're catching up here. I haven't seen you in a month. We're catching up here. Pumpkins. I saw this in Ann Arbor today. You don't have a pumpkin. That is a pumpkin. That right there is a pumpkin. That thing was the size of a car, and there were two of them on the back of a flatbed trailer. We don't usually talk about vegetables on MedTech Crossroads, but today I couldn't help it. But we're talking about some really cool things. We are going to be talking about ISO 13485. Everyone is talking about how does ISO 13485 relate to FDA? And also this question of how long does it really take? We got a listener question this week. How long does this process really take? And I think it's a really good question because what happens officially and what happens in reality are two different things. So we'll be talking about both of those as well as the events coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. ISO 13485, it's really trending these days. People are talking about what is it, how do I get it, what is a quality system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want to talk today about how ISO 13485, the quality standard, international quality standard, relates to the FDA. And this has been a topic of discussion for years, but it's actually gotten a little bit more traction starting at the beginning of 2022. But first of all, what is ISO 13485? And for that matter, what is this thing that we like to call 21 CFR 820? Well, ISO 13485 is an international consensus standard, right? It's voluntary. No one is going to make you follow. It's not quite true, but that's the principle behind it. 21 CFR 820 Code of Federal Regulations is actually ensconced into U.S. law. So one is an international consensus standard. The other is U.S. law. What aren't they? This is important. Neither one of them represents a clearance of a medical device. Neither one of them represents your design of your medical device. While they have more often to do with manufacturing, although they do have to do with design, it doesn't represent that you're successful at manufacturing. What are they? Well, ultimately, each one of these is an auditable process. You're basically saying, look, I planned what I was going to do. I did it, and now I can prove it to you that this is what I did. That makes it auditable. Audible means you can hear it. Auditable means somebody can walk in, they can ask you for objective evidence, documents, and then they can see if you're planning, doing, and then documenting that you did it. These are similar in principle to ISO 9001. Many times driving down a highway, you'll see a factory with ISO 9001, a flag flying outside. It's just saying we can do what we say we can do. For the purposes for which we exist, we have the ability to plan, do, and then prove that we did it. Now, like I said, one of these is a certification that you can get from a notified body delegated by a competent authority. Most of these are coming out of Europe. The other is just a law. You can't get a certification to 21 CFR 820. That doesn't really matter that much, but I will say that a lot of times companies will advertise and say, oh, we have ISO 13485, or we're FDA registered, so therefore you don't need to worry about quality systems. And the reality is, nothing could be further from the truth. In the FDA's eyes, quality systems are the responsibility of the company that's putting the device on the market. You need to comply with what you need to comply with. Now you can have others help you in that process. And perhaps if a vendor has a certification to 13485, they might be able to leverage that to help you. We're going to talk about how 13485 plays in the US system today, but I just want to make that point up front that having these things by a vendor does not automatically make you, if you're a medical device startup, does not make you compliant. Something that has to be leveraged and used. So what are the kinds of areas that are covered by these sorts of standards or regulations? Well, it's things like how you run your company, the management aspects of the company, how you audit your company, how you train employees, how you design and develop a product, how you maintain your documents, how you run your purchasing controls for what you're going to build, how you know whether to accept or reject parts and subsystems and systems that are coming through your assembly process. How do you do installation and qualification of installation? The list goes on and on and on through all the things you need to think about for how you run your company, how you maintain your company, how you design, document, manufacture, all of that. And it's the kind of thing that is important to follow, even if you don't have such a certification. You do need to think about these kinds of things, really, even if you're doing a Class 1 device that doesn't require quality systems compliance. But ultimately, if you are required to have it and do it, it's so that somebody in authority can audit you. Our focus here is US FDA. So in either case, the question is, how is US FDA going to audit me? And what's all the fuss? Why talk about two different standards? Well, that's exactly the question. Why talk about two different standards? That's ridiculous. Why should I have to comply with ISO 13485 and 21 CFR 820? They're subtly different. That means that if I say I have a quality management system, I now have to do work to make it compliant to 13485 and to 820. Who would ever require that? Well, it turns out no one's actually requiring you, no one entity is requiring you to be compliant to both of those. But if you want to sell in Europe, 13485 is ubiquitous. And if you want to sell in the US, 820 is. So in reality, most international medical device companies are functionally required to comply with both, to go through all of the work of complying with both. Fortunately, there is this thing called the MDSAP, the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which at least tries to streamline the auditing of that. But for years, FDA has wanted to go further. They've wanted really to chuck 820 and to adopt 13485 to be in keeping with the rest of the world, because it's not a bad standard. But they can't really legally do that. They can't just toss 820 out the window. So what's the solution to this? Well, the solution to this looks something like incorporation. And I want to show you something here. This from the Johnner Institute, and credit where credit is due. Dr. Christian Johnner has a whole article on this. But I love this very, very simple graphic right here. The planned amendments, this is as of early 2022, it's been nearly 2 years. We'll talk about this later. The FDA has largely decided to gut 820 and add a reference to 13485. Incorporation by reference. In other words, the old 820 looks like what's on the left, and the new 820 rips a bunch out and then places 13485 in. The goal there would be to obsolete certain parts of 820 because they're contained in 13485. So they're not going to rip 820 entirely out. You still have to comply with it, but it is changing. And by complying with 1345, you're going to get an awful lot of credit, and parts of 820 would be removed. There's a presentation from the FDA as of a few years ago by Karen Massley Joseph, We won't go through the whole thing, but it's a very interesting presentation covering the same material. She notes that on February 23rd is when FDA published their proposed amendments to 21 CFR 820 here. Most of it would be incorporation by reference, as Dr. Johnner said, and the public comment period is now closed. That was closed in May of 2022. So the idea, like we said a minute ago, pull out most of 820, incorporate by reference ISO 13485, and you can see here in this table, well, if the requirements are substantively similar, then couldn't we just use 13485? Or if there's things that we do need to address, we'll have parts of 820 that still exist to be able to reference those. In other words, we'll keep the things in green and address the differences, but the other parts will just reference 13485. And that sounds really good. A lot of cool things in this document. But I think that the real issue here that we have not seen action on, one of these documents mentioned that December 2023 is when the Office of Management and Budget, we're done with that document, Office of Management and Budget at FDA said December 2023 is when this should all be implemented. Well, it's October, and search as I might, I still don't see that we're ready to make that change yet. And of course, this has been years in coming. FDA has been wrestling because it would take an act of Congress to make certain types of changes in this, and we continue to wait. So for the moment, this is definitely something that is still a have to do both, benefit from MD-SAP when you can. But for those who are interested in, does 13485 cover me? Do I have to get that? The answer right now is still no. 820 is what you're complying to in the US. That being said, if this does go into an effect, when it does, FDA is not saying you have to get a 13485 certification. I found that fascinating. They're saying you have to comply with it, but just like 820, they weren't actually expecting a certification. And so if this goes through, while for Europe you would be getting audited to 13485 and getting a certification from a notified body, which is perfectly nice and perfectly helpful, FDA, as of late, has been saying you don't actually need that certification. You just have to comply with the standard. So we'll see how that all pans out. The hope is that that maybe something like that finally, after decades, does come through. But time will tell, so stay tuned on that. If you like what you hear today, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. Send, as we did this week, got a wonderful comment from a listener asking some specific questions. Feel free. Contact at medtechcrossroads.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know. And as always, we hope that the time that you spend on MedTech Crossroads really saves you time in your MedTech product development journey. How long does it really take? Thanks to our listener, Stephen, for asking us this question. He had a very specific question, but at root, it was how long does this clearance process actually take? He said for a non-invasive device, but we're going to try to do this question justice. And at the root of the question that was asked, how long does it really take, is a recognition that what you hear and what actually happens are probably different things. So I want to take you here for a moment to Path Surveyor. PathSurveyor.com, you're free to use it. It is a tool that we've created into being. It's a front door for the FDA 510K database. And if we look here, the product code GZJ for a TENS unit. I just picked a TENS unit because it's an interesting device that can be used for pain relief. And what we see is it's a class 2 device. Oops, we're going to have to refresh this page because I totally hit the wrong button. Down the page here, one of the benefits of Path Surveyor is it shows you historic clearance times for the product code that you're looking at. As a freebie here, also recently approved devices in that product code, along with their K numbers that you can click on, as well as some redacted device full submissions. If you want to see the entire 510K for certain devices, they have been redacted, but they are down there, and you can take a look at those. But let's talk about these clearance times. How long does it actually take to get a TENS unit, for example, cleared in the US, from the time that the FDA receives the application and acknowledges it to the time that the device is cleared? And as you can see, if we pick some of these troughs, here's one, 29 days. Wow, that's pretty good. Every investor and entrepreneur in the place is going, yay, that's what I want for my device. Here's another one recently in April this year, 60 days. Not too bad. FDA gets the file, 60 days later, you have a clearance. Here's another one, 79 days, also respectable. 29 days, we said that one, 56 days, not too shabby. What's this peak? 783 days. What's this peak? 598 days, with everything in between. Hundreds of days, tens of days. What's the right answer? And why are these so different? That's one product code. Let's take a look at another. Let's take a look at the DPS product code. The DPS product code. Oops, didn't quite get it to come up. Oh, let's take a completely different one, as long as we're here. EKX, I don't even know what it is. That's a dental handpiece. Let's try over here. There we go. Here's another one. This is a picture archiving and communications system for radiology. Just to show you can do this for any product code. And here are the historic clearance times for 510K under product code PGY. There are some pretty short ones, 21 days, 26 days, but some of the peaks, 252, 264, and one that I can't get to pop up here because of the cursor, but we're in the couple hundred days of time. Going back to pre-2015, you can see there was a 400-day clearance that probably didn't make anyone very happy. So again, what's behind all of this? Well, let's start, first of all, with the official timeline for a 510K. FDA says that officially, well, here's the big change. There is actually a new process. Starting October 1st of this year, we're already in it. We're 19 days into it. All 510K submissions, unless they are exempted, have to be submitted as electronic submissions using eStar. For the longest time, we had to send in paper copies with a CD or a thumb drive. The shippers got a lot of business with overnight shipping. But since eStar is now the law of the land, we're going to focus on the new process. And FDA has some cool client portals and dashboards and things like that. When they get a submission, they assign a K number. So for example, K2300001, 23-00001. That's the first submission of the calendar year 2023. K230002, that's the second submission of the 2023 calendar year. What happens next? Well, usually within about 7 days, FDA has the right to issue what they call a hold letter, to say, hold up, something's wrong here, we're not okay with it. You have up to 180 days to respond to that hold letter. Now, hopefully you won't take all of that, otherwise you wouldn't have submitted this in the first place. If you don't get a hold letter, you're going to get an acknowledgement letter. And FDA tries to do a substantive review of your file within 60 days from the receipt of submission. FDA's goal is to issue a substantially equivalent or not substantially equivalent decision within 90 days of the receipt of your file. Now, of course, That's not the whole story, because many submissions take more than 90 days. What happens? Well, FDA reaches out with what's called an additional information request, and they can do this multiple times. The additional information request gives you an additional 180 days to respond to the agency. That's your clock time. Now, if you don't respond to them, this application is considered withdrawn, and you're going to have to start again with a completely new 510K. Those are the kinds of things that officially delay the FDA timeline. It's largely, hey, you didn't send us what we need, or hey, we need more information. And that can push it out, and with multiple additional information requests, the timeline can get longer. But in theory, within 90 days, plus the AI requests. Well, what are the things that you can do to mess this up? Well, not responding quickly to an AI or not having all the information in your filing in the first place. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But where I want to take you, and I think this is just absolutely fascinating. This is what's wrong with Gene. What's absolutely fascinating is a 288-page document reporting on the Medical Device User Fee Act for fiscal year 2023. Wow, you have to say that with a lot of energy to get excited about it. And we're not going to do the whole thing, folks. But let's take a look at the index here. PMAs, pre-market authorizations. We're going to skip that entirely, but they've got metrics, goals, reporting on how FDA has been doing at PMAs. Where we're interested, Section 6, 510K performance. And we're going to just sort of zoom down here and find the section on 510K performance. How has the agency been doing fiscal year 2023 on 510Ks? This was written in Q3 and really has information on the first, I'd say, 6 months of the year. A lot of interesting details here. The percent of 510Ks that have an additional information request, that 180-day pause. You can do it as fast as you want, but you've got 180 days. What percent of 510Ks got that additional information request in that first FDA review cycle? Right now, that's around 67% for the last few years. That's pretty good. That means that they don't have a lot to ask on maybe 30% of the applications. But compare that to back in 2002, when the FDA only did additional information requests on about a third of the applications. That's quite a difference, going from 36% to 67%. But I also want to draw your attention to roughly around 2010 to 2012, when the agency was doing 75% additional information requests. And at the same time period, they were doing another 30% additional information requests on the second review cycle. So the 3/4 chance you were going to get asked for more information on the first cycle, and a 1/3 chance you were going to get asked for more information on the second cycle. Fortunately, even though we're at 67% for the first review cycle, we're down at like a couple of percent for the second review cycle. So if you get through that first review cycle without an information request or getting through that additional information request, you're in pretty good shape. So how long is FDA saying this takes on average? You saw a plot for a couple of different product codes dancing all around from 30 days to 400 days. What's the average from FDA's perspective? Well, in blue is the average days, FDA days, when their clock is not paused, to MDUFA decision. And while back at the turn of the millennia, can I say that? It was around 75 or 80%. And then in COVID, it was back up to nearly 83%. It's been hovering in that 60 to 80 days, sorry, not percent, days range, which is within its window, right? It's more than their 60-day goal to get back to you. It's less than their 90-day goal for the decision. So those are the FDA days. The days that it takes a company to interact with the FDA in that similar range. We're in that 70-day range. So during COVID, we were up in the 160-day average. Maybe of late, maybe 140 days is a good thing to think. You've submitted to FDA. On average, what should I expect? Well, about a 2/3 chance that I'm going to get an additional information request, and about a 140-day average window to clearance. 140-day average window to clearance. Could I get it in 30 days? Maybe. Rare. Could it take 400? Maybe. Rare. What should I expect my average is? About 140 days. I'm going to take you on to some other data from this that I thought was really interesting. How many 510Ks are pending at the end of a time period? Of late, they've had a lot pending more than 90 days, but we can blame COVID for that. When they were really humming here in 2010 to 2020, they were barely carrying any more than 90 days. But carrying from quarter to quarter and carrying from year to year, we're in the 1,000 or so. Because if you apply at the end of the year, they're not going to finish it that year. They're going to carry it over to the next year. About 80%, roughly 80%, get a substantially equivalent decision from FDA. So if you've submitted and you just want to play the numbers, about 80% probability, 80 to 87% probability, you're going to get a substantially equivalent positive decision. Of course, it depends on your submission, right? The ones that don't get through are not getting through just out of probabilistic thing. It's because they weren't necessarily a submission that FDA could buy into. A few more metrics here on 510Ks. Fiscal year 2023 by Q3, 2,628 510Ks received. 33 were closed before they even made it out of the gate. 1,800 accepted on the first cycle. If we come down here, we've got the number of substantive interactions FDA had, nearly 2,000. There's all sorts of data in here. This thing is just absolutely chock full. You can look it up if you want. I did think this was interesting. The rate of substantially equivalent decisions was nearly 99% of the decisions made in 2023. Of the decisions made in 2023, only 10 out of 1,000 basically got NSE. So NSE is actually relatively rare. It takes some work to get an NSE decision, and about 1% withdrawn. Now, of course, withdrawn doesn't mean you chose to withdraw it. It could also mean that you failed to meet 180-day additional information timeline as well. So that's 510K data. As long as we've got this document open, I want to look with you at de novos, because some people are going to say, well, 510Ks are great, but what if I have a de novo? How long is that going to take? And for the last 20 years, it's been all over the map. 2009 was not a good year. In the intervening years around that, not a good year for de novos. Oh, we got a 510K question in Q&A. Steve, are you able to read that for us?
I certainly can.
Before we go on to de novos?
Anonymous person asking, can the FDA be putting more 510Ks on hold in order to stop their clock while being understaffed? So can the FDA artificial delay stuff by putting it on hold because they're understaffed?
Yeah, and it's, of course, not every 510K actually meets the MDUFA goal of 90 days, right? So they do what they have to do. And I'm not. Maybe the questioner wants to ask a follow-up question, but FDA does miss deadlines. It does happen. I feel like what we've noticed more is that they're gonna hit that deadline if they possibly can, because that makes them look good. What we've noticed and heard a lot of folks say, not just us, is that the quality of the reviews is going down when they're understaffed. So they find somebody to throw on it, but it's not clear that the quality of the questions or the reasonableness of the asks is really there. And so I think what we've seen is less of them just, if I were an investor or I were a CEO, my worry would not be FDA is going to miss their review deadline by 3 weeks. That would not be my worry. My worry would be that FDA is going to put a non-qualified reviewer on the project, and they are going to ask questions that are completely clinically or technically not reasonable, not appropriate, and force me to now answer questions with objective evidence, testing, etc., that just isn't appropriate. I'm doing fluff work at that point. So I think that's the bigger concern. But can they do that? Yeah, if they're short-staffed, they do miss deadlines, but less than missed deadlines. I'd worry more about the appropriateness of throwing non-qualified staff to answer questions, or to ask questions. That was a great question. Appreciate it. We'll go on to de novos, and if anyone else has any questions, we'd be happy to address them as well. So pre-COVID de novo timelines, more on average, right? We said 140 days on average of late for 510Ks, but something more akin to 260 days for de novos. And then during COVID, that really bumped up quite a bit. So de novos all over the place, a lot of volatility there. Not a good time right now, but we trust that those numbers are coming down. If you look at this though, the companies, right? The companies are spending half a year or more responding to FDA in a de novo. They're actively spending half a year or more responding to the agency. So, not as many de novos received, 73 during fiscal year 2023 by the third quarter. 50 of them accepted or need further work, another 18. And let's see if we can find the number on how many review cycles, 1.29 average review cycles. The maximum FDA days to MDUFA decision, 150 days during this calendar year. There have only been 3 de novos granted in fiscal year 2023. 2 withdrawn, so you're up there, you're batting with FDA. And it appears that of the ones that have either been granted or withdrawn, it's about 50-50. So that's not a wonderful percentage to be up against. And of course, granted now here's only 42%. Here's our percentages. Declined 14%, withdrawn 28%, deleted 14%. So not great odds on the de novo front in fiscal year 2023, but interesting nonetheless. One more thing, as long as we've got this open, pre-subs, people wonder how many pre-subs FDA is dealing with. Well, about 2,800 received as of 6/30/2023. So they are dealing with nearly 6,000 pre-subs a year, which is quite a few. We won't break this down all the way, but just so you know, documents like this exist, and you can go read 288 pages of FDA MDUFA statistics. And if you are an investor or you are a CEO, I can say that this might be a good document for you to at least crack open and have an idea of what you're up against. But back to the original question. What does it really take to get this through? Well, we've seen the answer. Somewhere these days in the vicinity of 260 days on average, but that's a wildly varying number for a de novo. 140 days on average for a 510K, but that's a wildly varying number. Maybe the more important question is this: what can you do as a startup, as an entrepreneur, as somebody working on a startup, as an investor, to minimize the delays? Let's talk about 3 areas The first area is before the submission itself. Before you make a submission, what can you do to minimize the delays? Well, if your device is subject to design controls, don't you dare get to a 510(k) submission without having developed the device under design controls. As we've shown on the show before, you can map the kinds of things that you need to address in design controls pretty directly to the sections of a 510(k) that you need to submit. It doesn't mean at all that everything that you put in your design controls is going to FDA for your 510(k), but it is really how this information gets created. Don't forget to review the contents of a 510(k), which we've covered on the show as well, and certainly work with folks who've seen recent submissions and recent hiccups. When you're in the middle of the submission, how do you do it? What do you need to do when you're putting that submission together? Probably the most important thing is make sure you've got all the right parts in there. There's nothing more embarrassing than getting a rejection by the FDA, which these days, it's no longer the refuse to accept checklist. Historically, there was a 2-week refuse to accept period, and that is going away with the advent of eStar. But now they can just sort of electronically look at it and go, hey, is this good enough? But make sure you've got all the required parts. If you give them an incomplete submission that doesn't even have all the things that they ask for, you're going to regret it pretty quickly. Don't worry, you have 180 days to respond. But after the submission, and I think this is one of the most overlooked parts of the process. Maybe you've had a pre-sub, maybe you haven't, but you make your submission to FDA. And your team is going to have an idea of what it's very confident about and the parts of the submission that you're a little bit less confident about. Places you're worried that the FDA may ask you a question. Those are the places to not stop working. Because it's going to take at least 2 months before the FDA probably gets back to you with anything substantial. You can buy yourself 2 extra months in the process if you don't wait for the FDA. You made the best submission you could. You made it as robust as you could. You in good faith submitted with the information you believe you need to satisfy the agency. But if there's any doubt in your mind, doing that additional testing, documenting whatever else you can, especially on areas that you think may raise questions with the agency, if it does and they come back asking for additional information, your turnaround time might be a week instead of 2 more months. Or, in the worst case, that additional 180 days that you're allotted but you don't really want to use. Because if you go to 181 days, your 510(k) is off the books and you have to start all over again. So this is just some advice for if you're going out there to submit a 510(k) or a de novo. These are kinds of the timelines. You should be thinking, if we just bring it all the way back. Is this a 3-month process? Because that's what the FDA says. They want to review it in 90 days. No, it's not a 3-month process, except in the best of cases. This is something that you should think of for a 510(k) as about a half a year, or for a de novo as closer to 3/4 or most of a year. The reality is that in both cases, many companies, because of additional information requests, will find themselves engaged with the FDA over the course of a substantially longer portion of the year than 6 months. And that really covers all sorts of devices. We're not talking about PMAs here, but in terms of Class 1 and Class 2 devices subject to 510(k), that 6 months to a year window is really what you should be thinking about once the device is submitted to FDA, not once you have a prototype. Not once you have a manufacturable design, but from the time that the FDA gets your completed 510(k) submission. So hopefully that helps. Happy to take any questions that may be there. Or if you have any later, send it to us, contact@medtechcrossroads.com. Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. Share it with your friends. We love getting questions from you. Lots of good questions this week and last week. And we just hope that the time that you spend on MedTech Crossroads will save you time in your medical product development journey. All right, and finally today, I want to talk to you about upcoming events. We're going to do it a little bit differently this week. We're going to go straight to the websites of the organizations that have put these events forward and are reminding us about them. The first one, our friends at MishBio, their events calendar, always great things. They're having a governor's roundtable coming up. Governor Gretchen Whitmer will be at this event. We'll be there from Into Being. This is happening October 24th in the afternoon and evening, growing Michigan's life sciences industry. The Biomixer is coming up in Kalamazoo on November 2nd. Always a great event. The Biomixer, Kalamazoo, November 2nd. The kitchen, 600 Kitchen and Bar, 600 East Michigan Avenue, Kalamazoo, Michigan. Talk about cool local events there. From the FDA, I want to share some of these with you. The link is in the YouTube description, but a few interesting things happening here. Oops, we're on the wrong page. We're going to go back here. Coming up on the 24th, pre-market applications, opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Who should attend this meeting? Down here, interested stakeholders. This one, they're talking more about tobacco products, which is interesting. This one may not be as much interest to as many people. It looked from the outset like it was about other things. We're going to skip that one over. A little bait and switch there. Hate that bait and switch. The FDA Broad Agency Announcement Day, October 25th. FDA wants to partner with innovators, not necessarily for medical devices, but the development of regulatory science. So FDA wants to partner with people who have an idea of how they want to do regulatory science better. Maybe you've been burned by the FDA and you'd like some money, some collaboration to work on that. This would be the place to show up. October 25th, the Broad Agency Announcement Day. There's a webinar, CDRH's new draft guidances to continuing to modernize the 510K program. Best practices, clinical data, October 26th in the afternoon, a webinar with FDA about modernizing the 510K program. There's more coming up we'll cover in future weeks. There's not a lot happening on the wraps front that I noticed this week. There is a webcast about mastering your 510K submission process on October 25th also, and a bunch of local chapter events. Now, CAPA is not something we talk about a lot on the design side, but for those of you who might be listening who are with larger medical device manufacturers who are dealing with errors in your product, doing root cause investigation for CAPA could indeed be of a lot of interest. Corrective and preventive action. So there's some local events from MishBio, from FDA, and from RAPS. We're coming to the end of our show today. If anyone has any comments or questions that you would like to raise up, as you saw earlier, we're always happy to take them during the show or afterwards. Like we got an email from somebody saying, hey, how long does this really take? We appreciate those questions and comments as you're with us. So I'm just going to take a quick look here and see if we have any other questions or comments. Not seeing any. I want to thank you for being with us today on MedTech Crossroads. Always good to be with you live. We continue to do that. There will not be, due to travel, a live show next week, but we'll continue to bring you those throughout the fall as time is permitting, and you can always catch it on YouTube. We take the live shows if you want to watch the whole thing long form. We also break them up into segments in case you want to see just a small segment on a particular topic. And folks have told us multiple times they like sharing those shorter segments, oftentimes with startups that need to learn about something. We have series, how to get a 510K, how to de-risk your product, as well as series that we've done during the last few years. You can get to all of those series on our YouTube page. Hope you'll check it out. And like I said before, be sure to like and subscribe. I have to get used to saying that. It's kind of hard.
We do have one more question that just came in here.
Oh, we do have another question. Okay,
Yep,
what do we got?
Anonymous. Colleague received notice that their submission was sent to a third party for review instead of the FDA. Any insight into this?
Wow. I have never heard of it getting sent to a third party instead of the FDA, meaning that the FDA sent it to a third party. That would be fascinating to me. As we've talked about on the show before, the third party review program was established, and this is a personal opinion from experiences I've had, is not well loved by the FDA. It's a middleman in the middle of the process. It could be, this is purely speculation, it could be evidence that the FDA is taking submissions that are eligible for third-party review and submitting them themselves to a third party. Could it also be that they're not actually, this is purely speculation at this point, that they're not capable of actually handing it off on their own, but they recommend to the applicant that they send it over? I don't know, but that'd be fascinating to hear more about, because actually, let me just go to as long as we're here, there are certain product codes that will say, I don't know if we can get to it very quickly here. I'll take a quick look here. I'm not going to be able to pull it up really fast. There are certain product codes that say this is eligible for third-party review. And so it could be, this is again purely speculation, that if it's eligible for third-party review, does the FDA have a backdoor to just kick it over to the third party? That could well be. And I guess I can't say that would be the end of the world. Where we've seen third-party review go terribly south is when the third party isn't thinking the same way as the FDA is thinking. Right? So if FDA were saying, hey, we can't do all of this, third party, please review it, that would be maybe not quite as bad. But with FDA, if they wanted to review something, they're like, yeah, that's our domain, we review that. And the third party comes in not thinking about it the same way that the agency thinks about it. We have watched the agency step all over the third party's findings, which means that you really had to fight through two bureaucracies rather than one. And that is just no fun at all. But thank you for that comment, that question.
Yeah, we got a little bit of an update to
Yep,
that. Just
okay.
commenting on that. They noted it was a simpler product, so they're noting the FDA may be keeping more complex one, although they are saying that the third party has been slower in communication than official FDA communication has been. So I think that sounds consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah.
And they may be offloading some of the simpler.
The only part that I'm really not aware of is, does FDA have the authority to say you didn't submit to a third party, but we're going to use them anyways? And again, I will hypothesize just a little bit more. Again, all speculation, but FDA does use consultants on review committees all the time. So, maybe it doesn't beg our belief to say that they would simply use a third party review firm in their processes. And it's also true to the commenter's point. Most product codes that say you can use a third-party reviewer, they tend to be a little bit more commoditized. They tend to be a little bit simpler. You're not going to do a de novo through a third party, but something that's starting to be recognized as a slightly more commoditized product. Those are usually the ones that they say, yeah, by the way, you can also submit this to a third party. Now, as long as we're on the topic, there's a promise that sometimes people get carried away with, and this is if you're submitting to a third party, which is not our commenter's point. If you're submitting to a third party, it sounds like a sweetener because the review time is reduced by about 30 days. And unfortunately, we've found is that the additional time that it takes the third party and FDA to argue about the application doesn't justify and make up for the 30 days you're going to gain. So still probably only recommendable for, as the commenter said, for devices that really, really are pretty simple. Great. Appreciate those comments. Appreciate those questions. Always good to be with you. Hope you're enjoying this beautiful fall as the colors change. Watch out for the pumpkins the size of cars because those will get you every time. Looking forward to seeing you not next week, but the week after on MedTech Crossroads. Thanks again.